Have you ever wanted to build a fully scalable production-ready cloud application for free? And not just free for a limited time, but free forever? Sounds too good to be true? Well, it's possible. In this video we will deploy a complete to-do app on AWS without ever paying a dime. This includes UI, Backend API services, authentication and a database, all powered by Amazon services that stay free forever. Let's dive in. Many AWS services offer a free trial, but after a while they start charging you. We don't want that. We want free forever. So here's the plan. We will use CloudFront as a kind of a reverse proxy, which will be the single entry point to our application. CloudFront will proxy the application's API request to AWS Lambda, where our main nodejs backend code will live. CloudFront is actually a content delivery network, and we will also use it to cache and serve our application static content like HTML, JavaScript, CSS files, and images. The AWS Lambda backend will use DynamoDB to store the user to-do lists. And we want to have a secure user and authentication service. Here comes AWS Cognito. After user login, Cognito will generate a JSON Web Token, which will later on be used to authenticate and authorize the subsequent requests. And how are we going to deploy all of that? We can use the AWS console and configure all the needed components manually. That is the easiest way, right? No. Let's have the infrastructure deployment as a code. It is actually easier that way, you'll see. Just a step back before we start. To be on the safe side, let's create a basic billing monitoring, which will alert us on any expenses. Next, let's create the Terraform provider configuration. We just set the AWS Terraform module here and the default AWS region. We have then a Terraform file that defines some variables, and a separate file for each of the needed infrastructure components. Let's start with the backend. First, we package our backend nodejs application to a zip file that we will set as a code for the Lambda function. The nodejs application itself defines some HTTP endpoints, implements the authentication using a JSON Web Token verification, and manages the operations to the database. The JSON Web Token is generated during login by Cognito and contains signed information for the authenticated user. And this is where the authentication trust anchor is formed. Our Node.js app can verify this token against Cognito and get the logged-in user information from the token claims. But let's go back to the Lambda. It needs an identity access management role, which defines its permissions. Then the Lambda gets deployed using the AWS Lambda function Terraform resource. To keep the code clean, we will also set some environment variables that will be injected in the Lambda runtime. Those variables will set the used Cognito pool, and the values for the Cognito user pool and Cognito client ID come from the Cognito Terraform deployment. Then we have our DynamoDB Terraform file, which is quite straightforward. It just creates the DynamoDB table. And lastly comes the CloudFront deployment. In CloudFront, we create a distribution, which sets the single endpoint for accessing our application, and some global settings like SSL certificates and additional domains. Then we have an origin, which is the destination service. We have two origins, one for our application APIs, which is the Lambda function, and one for our UI frontend. For the API calls, we do not want cache, as each response is different, but that is not the case for the static content. The CloudFront origin for the frontend application files is GitHub. It's just that we should set some custom HTTP headers in the CloudFront responses in order for the files to be processed correctly by the browser. And lastly, we have some CloudFront behaviors. Each of them defines how a specific file type is handled by CloudFront, like which is the origin that actually hosts the content, should the response be cached, should some headers be added, and so on. That's it. We've just deployed a fully working cloud application on AWS without paying a cent. Completely free forever. In the next videos, we'll add a custom domain for our application and do a CI/CD automation setup using GitHub Actions. If you found this helpful, hit the like button and subscribe for more cloud and dev tutorials. Got questions? Drop them in the comments, I'd love to help.